I did this with my supervisors. They're also my co-authors. The paper that I'm talking about here is currently in review at Climate Change Biology, so hopefully it'll get accepted soon. Now, I'm a bit new to land surface modelling, and I'm kind of new to this group as well, but I imagine that a lot of people here are kind of interested in implementing processes, perhaps ecosystem processes or land processes or plant processes within the land surface models so that we can accurately represent what's actually going on in the land and in ecosystems. And so that's essentially what this research was about. This was about implementing the process of photosynthetic thermal acclimation into cable so that we could see its impact upon future carbon uptake and storage in Australian wooded ecosystems. And to take you through this, I first have to talk about what is thermal acclimation of photosynthesis. So most of you probably already know, but just in case there's a few of you that don't, photosynthesis is a temperature-dependent process. So photosynthesis increases with temperature up to a maximum, and then it declines again in this, what do we call it, a convex parabolic relationship. The shape of this relationship will vary by species, but it also varies with photosynthetic pathway, and it can shift with growth temperature. So what that means is that plants have a bunch of alterations they can make to their internal structures and their photosynthetic enzymes, such that when they're grown in low temperatures, they have a tendency to optimize photosynthesis for low temperatures. And when they're grown in high temperatures, they have a tendency to optimize photosynthesis for higher temperatures. And what we've got on this slide here is just a summary of some of the internal changes that they can make. So photosynthetic thermal acclimation is not always implemented in LSMs though. This is a really old schematic, so the picture has probably changed quite a lot since this research was done. But in the study here, only of the models that were studied, only around 40% of them had included any process around photosynthetic thermal acclimation. But other studies have shown us that it can have a significant impact upon uptake and storage of carbon in global ecosystems. So this is a study from 2015 where photosynthetic, so it's global runs that were done to 2100 under climate change, clearly. And these are runs with and without photosynthetic thermal acclimation. And you can see that it's around a 10% difference in carbon storage globally by 2100. So the run with photosynthetic thermal acclimation is the one in the black there. So it's about 10% higher. And yet there's regional variation in how photosynthetic thermal acclimation affects simulations at the end of the century. So this is some other research that at the global scale clearly that shows in some regions there'll be a negative impact of thermal acclimation, but in other regions there'll be a positive impact of thermal acclimation. And the studies tend to vary in those regional effects. But there's really not very much that's been done at ecosystem scale in relation to thermal acclimation, and nothing in Australia. And so what we did was we implemented thermal acclimation in cable pop. Well, actually, Jürgen implemented thermal acclimation, and I used cable pop to run some simulations. So what we did was we took these fairly newly developed functions by Kumarathung, and the functions are based on data, but essentially you can see there that in the y-axis on the data that they used, the y-axis shows the thermal optima of photosynthesis, and the x-axis is showing you temperature of growth. And you're essentially seeing there that there's a positive linear relationship between the thermal optima of photosynthesis and the temperature in which plants are grown. And so we took the functions. So this is it's the equation. It's the function in cable. It's the peak Arrhenius equation that describes the temperature dependence of photosynthesis. And I don't like putting equations on the screen because I'm not very good at maths. So I prefer, but I put it there so that I can kind of just show you what it does. So this is the photosynthetic process rate. And what we have here is we have the activation energy. This parameter, it basically adjusts depending upon the temperature of growth, which is the temperature of the last 20 days, sorry, T max of the last 20 days. And then these two terms also get adjusted. These are the entropy term and, sorry, it's one term, but it's in two places. And it also becomes dependent upon the temperature of growth and also the temperature of home, which is the mean annual temperature of the last 30 years. And so we took 17 ecosystems from the AusPlux network and we simulated future carbon through cable. We had 17 ecosystems from 5 ecoregions. There was tropical savannas, tropical forests, Mediterranean woodlands, temperate woodlands, and temperate forests as well. We used the HADGEM2 ES climate simulations from the CIMIP5 simulation run through ISIMIP and the RCP 8.5 scenario. And in that, we had a change in mean annual temperature of between 3 and 5 degrees across the sites, and mean annual precipitation predictions tend to decline, but up to around 300 millimetres. And a couple of sites, there is some increases there. And so what did we find? Well, we found overall, climate change has a positive impact on carbon uptake. So this is just GPP and MPP, and we've grouped they're grouped in terms of the eco region. So climate change tends to have a positive impact on carbon uptake, but that thermal acclimation of photosynthesis really only has a substantial effect on the tropical ecoregions. So that's the tropical savannas and the tropical forest sites. We see that in the tropical savannas, we have, without acclimation, about a 38% increase in carbon uptake, but with acclimation on it goes to a 66% increase. And in tropical forests, there's about a 10% difference. And you can see in the rest of the ecosystem types there's like 1 or 2 or 3% difference between the acclimation off and the acclimation on run. We also see a similar effect in cumulative GPP and MPP. So what you're seeing here is the difference between the acclimation on and the acclimation off run. For the cumulative GPP and MPP, GPP is the solid line, MPP is the dashed line. We've got them grouped by ecosystem type again, and each line represents a different, or each colour represents a different ecosystem. And again, we see the tropical forests and the tropical savannas have the greatest increase in the cumulative uptake that can be attributed to thermal acclimation of photosynthesis. So in relative terms, though, the greatest effect is on the tropical savannas with around a 25% impact, and tropical forests around 10%, and the other ecosystem types just got that 1 to 3% sort of increase in uptake. And again, like as you would expect, because carbon in trees is a downstream effect of GPP and MPP, we also see a similar effect in live tree carbon. And this is sort of, we've calculated the thermal acclimation effect, which is the difference between the thermal acclimation on and the thermal acclimation off run, the annual live tree carbon divided by the historical period. And sorry, the historical baseline. And again, what we see is that a strong effect on the tropical ecosystems, with the greatest effect on the tropical forests with about 50 megagrams per hectare, greater at the end of the century than compared to the tropical forest with about 34 megagrams of carbon higher at the end of the century. And finally, we also did in response to one of the reviewers, we did a simulation with CO2 held constant. And what we see there is the significant effect of CO2 on the simulations. So what we see is when we remove the CO2 effect, the climate change has a negative effect on carbon uptake and storage in these ecosystems, but that the negative effect is slightly lower in the tropical ecosystems, and we can attribute that to thermal acclimation. And again, it's similar. These are the plots showing the thermal acclimation effect for GPP, NPP, and live tree carbon. And again, we see a small thermal acclimation effect in the static CO2 simulations, but interestingly, it sort of declines after about 2075. And so finally, in summary, climate change in our simulations, climate change enhanced forest carbon uptake and storage. The greatest effect was in tropical forests, temperate forests, and temperate woodlands. We can attribute that effect largely due to CO2 fertilisation, but being careful to note that this is in the absence of any large-scale disturbances, such as enormous wildfires or such. And finally, thermal acclimation and photosynthesis matters. And that it has a large influence in tropical ecosystems with the highest absolute effect in tropical forests, but a really strong relative effect in tropical savannas, and that its effect is much smaller in other ecosystem types. And that's all. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 questions. I'm going to ask the first question.
How do you think that it will affect the competition of vegetation types into the future? Have you looked into that one? At the moment, for example, especially tropical savannas, you've got woodification that's more anthropogenic induced because of the grazing grasslands. Would you think that there's going to be an acceleration of that happening now? Or?
Do you mean in the model?
Well, as part of that, in reality, when you see the effect of the acclimatization, translating that into real conditions into the future, do you think that will have an effect on the competition between vegetation?
I'm not sure. I think that I went into the research thinking that that increase in temperatures would cause the plants to kind of respond negatively. And I think what I see in the research is that the plants won't have a negative response to increase in temperature, but they'll just tend to shift their ability to photosynthesize upwards.